Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Bailey, Redmond Mag editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session, as well as welcoming you to our session, Why You Need End User Ransomware Training Summit, brought to you by Lacework and Beyond Trust. The editorial staff of Redmond Mag have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on the topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. During today's third session, we will be giving away a DJI Mini 3 Pro drone, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, Lacework and Beyond Trust, available on the console right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of Lacework and Beyond Trust underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask that you check out these resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, End User Ransomware Training Tips, Tricks, and Pitfalls. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump. Ian Thornton-Trump is the Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax and the CTO of Octopi Managed Services. His 25-year career includes service in the intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, and the RCMP. He's been a cybersecurity consultant for both multinational and regional organizations, and today, as virtual CISO, he helps both large and small companies build security operations and cyber threat intelligence programs. Take it away, Ian.
Oh, thank you so much, and it's absolutely delightful to be here. And I have to premise, opening up for Brian Posey is just fantastic because the next speaker is someone that is awesome. So yes, running down kind of what this is all about is I do speaking and presenting regularly. I'm pundit and commentator in the InfoSec press, but my passion has been really producing and hosting a video podcast with my mates Phil Ingram, MBE, and Lisa Forte, partner at Red Goat. Give them a follow on LinkedIn. You can also follow me. I'm pretty easy to find with the Thornton-Trump. I think I'm the only Thornton-Trump in the universe at this point. But really an area of specialty that I'm looking at right now is strategic threat intelligence, geopolitics, economics, and recently demographics. I mean, last year it was so delightful for me to be able to present a bunch of information around demographics and how that's going to affect the way we work, how that's going to affect cyber threat actors. So I have a sprinkling of that into this presentation today, of course, but mostly what we're going to be doing with this video podcast is we're going to be looking at the intricacies of end users and how they need to react when they think they've done something wrong, and how, as an IT department or a security team, we engage. Now, it's interesting to me because we've seen this kind of graph. You may or may not have seen it before, but this is really about the evolution of cyber attacks from the very earliest ones in really the 1980s to the 1990s era, right? And then we had the 2000s to the 2010s era, and now we're looking at just more strategic attacks, and even beyond that now, strategic attacks that have potential military or civilian target value, AI-enabled attacks, integrated cyber capabilities between kinetic activities, and also affecting the world around us through cyber attacks because of the interconnected nature and Internet of Things. But hilariously, even though we've gone all the way from this span of 1980s all the way up to, what we're seeing potentially and predictive in the 2030s, is really breaks down into the latest and greatest Verizon data breach report, where I yanked this stat out of. is we're generally talking about external actors, and I'll have a little bit to say about internal actors. We're talking about a human element, which includes social engineering attacks on your business, errors by humans, and misuse. Now, ultimately, this is a difficult stat to parse down. And this is why I would take the Verizon data breach report over, say, more of a self-serving report that might be generated by vendors in trying to determine at what point the human element failed, right? Clicking on a phishing link, it could be argued that clicking on a phishing link that was delivered properly to somebody's inbox is not a human element failure that is solely on the shoulders of the person that clicked it. It's also a human element or failure of the security control that you have to protect that particular user from doing that particular activity. Just like processes and policies and training and all of those things go into trying to harden your organization against social engineering attacks, errors that humans have made, or even misuse of technology that has occurred. We have this central theme that we have, that humans at some point seem to be one of the major reasons why we're suffering data breaches today. And that could range from not maintaining a solid IT asset management inventory to, configuring a firewall and somehow making a rule that takes away from the security posture of the organization because of an any rule that was buried deep within the firewall configuration. So errors and misuse happen. And the important thing to remember is these are not always malicious. Cyber attacks can occur that have damaged the organization, but the core of that particular cyber attack was not malicious in intent to begin with. And that's an important differentiation, especially when it comes to end users and triaging them, as it were, when they're about to have the worst day of their lives. Now, the other thing that really came and is rising, and this one is where we can look at social Darwinism as perhaps a model, but what we're seeing is social engineering attacks are pretexting incidents that nearly double last year's total. Now, whether or not AI is making phishing attacks more effective, but the idea here is there's a pretexting attack is a form of social engineering that involves fabricating a scenario, okay, to manipulate unsuspecting individuals into revealing sensitive information. That can happen at a micro level by just basically harvesting the email from an organization for, senior leadership, because there is no policy about how you should communicate with senior leadership. Perhaps there needs to be a generic email address established for the executive team at company, which is then reviewed prior to it actually being delivered into the inboxes of your executive team. Now, where AI is playing a role that we can really tangibly push our finger into is things like the deepfakes audio, the deepfakes video, requests that come in that have that crazy sense of urgency, but seem to be truthful enough. Like if I phone up an organization and I sent them a phishing email, and I'm pretty sure that phishing email has been saved into the junk folder, right? And then I call them up pretending that I'm an IT guy and saying, oh, by the way, there's an important email in your junk folder. I need you to click that link. And I'm impersonating your own help desk because the call display says help desk your company. That's a really difficult social engineering attack to avoid when there's a piece of truth associated with that. And this is where we're seeing the effectiveness of ransomware operators and scammers of penetrating the defenses of companies and organizations with a fair amount of efficiency. And again, this is a growing trend, right? Spraying and praying that somebody clicks on your phishing email. I've got to say, stuff does get through, but the amount of spam being killed by Google and other organizations like Microsoft is phenomenal. And there are tens of thousands of malicious emails that are being killed off, and you're getting tens, maybe hundreds at your organizations, which is then killed off further by whatever phishing defenses that you may have in sight. Now, this is where the IT security department really has to put the human first in the cybersecurity equation, as that, what we like to say, human firewall, to allow them not only to have the best defense possible, but to provide resources when something happens wrongly. Now, I want to kind of go macro a little bit and push out a little bit, because what we hear continuously in the InfoSec press is about vulnerability management, which honestly is the organization's responsibility to a part. However, what's really important is that if the organization's security involves interaction by users to keep their machines up to date, or when prompted to install vulnerabilities or to install patches for vulnerabilities quickly, that's a partnership that really does need to be worked on, because the organization needs to know why these patches are so vital, especially if these patches are under attack by a known threat actor, and that these patches prevent very bad things from happening. And this is the very bad things from happening, because if you're a software vendor and you're paying lip service to cybersecurity, and a threat actor gets a hold of your product and is able to repeatedly use it to gain a foothold in organizations. Now, I'm picking on Progress Software because what I'm seeing is a huge story arc now about a piece of critical a critical infrastructure that many organizations relied on becoming targeted by all of these vulnerabilities by threat actors repeatedly. And so this is one of those things that, if as a user in your organization, you know that you use it, for instance, we'll just use this as an example, but you know that you use move it to move it around, to transfer data, ironically, securely. But if you know as a user that you use that product, there's nothing wrong with asking the IT department if it's patched and up to date, because you've heard about it in the media, you've heard about the stories, because either A, maybe someone told you about them, or you're seeking your own knowledge out. And this is a really important aspect. Security's eyes can't be everywhere. We can only do what we can do, and that we have feeds for, and that we have an active, shall we say, tip line running in the forms of what is CISA saying, what is so-and-so tweeting. If Troy Hunt, who runs the Have I Been Pwned website, is trying to get a hold of your organization, it might be a really good idea to have a way to get a hold of your organization, because he may have some bad news for you. So there's all of these things that kind of rest on the shoulders of both IT and the users, and of course security and the executive team. And having an up-to-date endpoint, if you have any role in keeping things up to date, it's critical that you're part of the solution to the rampant cybercrime problem and data breach issues than be the problem. Because at some point, this is the user that clicked on the wrong link. Well, actually, it's probably a soldier that stood up during a gunfight. But bad things are going to happen. And we need to think about the idea and the idea of first aid in the context of helping our users when they've done something wrong, or when they've potentially injured the company. Okay? So what I'm trying to do here is paint the relationship between the physical world of safety culture and first aid with the idea of cyber awareness and understanding the threats that you're going to face online, because not everybody is training out there and not everybody is in an active combat situation. I understand that. But when you're online and you're working for a business, it's kind of like being on the front lines of a conflict. And I always thought that it was great when I saw Canadian medics when I was in the military out there. And I've adapted a saying that I got from the sergeant major during one of my officer training courses, because he described first aid as what is currently inside you and is now found outside of you is a problem that needs to be fixed. And what is currently outside of you and should be inside of you is also a problem that has to be fixed, right? So we can adapt that same thing to the network, right? Which is really about if there's information within your organization that is now outside your organization, that could be a problem and it needs to be fixed. Vice versa, if there's information inside your organization that shouldn't be there, it also has to be fixed. So it's the dichotomy of the integrity of your organization that you're really trying to deal with. And bad things can happen just like anything out there when you're training. Now, one of the responsibilities that an organization does have is to measure out its attack surface. If I can get you to do one thing in 2024 is go to DNS Dumpster, put in your domain, so that's the organization.com or .whatever, and dump the list of hosts that it presents you with. It also presents you with a really nice picture of your organization. Now, keep in mind, everybody can do this. Even the bad guys can do this. And every year, you should review the hosts that are publicly addressable within your organization. And even if those hosts are, quote, behind a security control, like for instance, that host has a public DNS entry, but it's only addressable if you're inside the organization with a VPN. It's critical to test those things, because if you want to find the way the cyber criminals will burrow into your organization, it's about what you have exposed on the internet, okay? This is the other vector of attack that we're seeing that's really popular. It could be exposed legacy servers, for instance, which just happen to somehow have access to all of your executive team's emails, just like which just happened to Microsoft, right? So look at and just answer these questions, right? It's pretty simple. Is the system is still needed? Is that system a legacy entry that should have been cleaned up a long time ago? This happens all the time. And if it's a domain that you're paying for, there could be even a cost savings associated with the domain registration, right? Is the system critical? Okay, so if the system is critical, cool. What kind of mitigative controls do you have in place of it? Really common one is now to have the workloads have EDR on them, okay? So if this system is critical, do you have the mitigations in there? Is there a firewall entry that prevents certain geographies or even certain domains or allows only certain domains, blocking everything else? This is critical, right? Because if it is critical, it should be categorized as such and have those defenses, right? Should it be internally routed only? So why do we have a public DNS entry for something that is only used internally in the company? I see this quite often with organizations that have put, their repositories, their Confluence. They've made Confluence only available internally because it's sitting on its own server. But unfortunately, it's publicly addressable. And it's all because networks are complex. You're always inheriting somebody else's work and things like that. And more importantly, and this is where you really engage with the business, and this is that nexus between users and managers and whatnot. What is the business justification for exposure? Now, many of these things are exposed because there's a business partner relationship. It needs to be accessible because of online it needs to be remotely accessible because you've got a third party or a team. Try and figure out a way to reduce your exposure, because for everything you take off the public internet, your actual security will increase, right? And you don't like to see things like legacy anything sitting on your public DNS, because a legacy thing or a test environment on the public thing is something that immediately is a magnet, or is a fish to a hungry bear, to give you a contemporary analogy, and is inviting the actual probing and exploring of that particular asset. So public DNS is public. It's useful to do your own attack surface enumeration, and again, engage with the users, because there could be stuff there that no longer needs to be there. Positive way of dialogue. Now, cyber first aid. I'm going to kind of, again, go with this first aid analogy, so please bear with me. In the first aid world, we talk about ABC, which really stands for the airway, the breathing, and the circulation. Now, to just sort of translate for you, airway is pretty self-explanatory. That means there's nothing, clogged in your throat, preventing you from breathing. If you are breathing, that is a good thing. And then circulation, which also means, like, if a bunch of stuff that's coming out of you shouldn't be, we need to stop that stuff from coming out of you. All right. That could be most likely blood. Now, for cyber first aid, it's a bit different, but I wanted to do the ABCs as I see them, which stands for awareness, belief, and caution. And I want to sort of underline this as kind of like very analogous to the airway, the breathing, and circulation. So the first awareness that we have is not about just that cybersecurity awareness training that's once a month. It is adopting and using technology to continuously reinforce the cybersecurity lessons that are given in awareness training. And again, awareness training has to be appropriate for the job role or job function that is going on. Now, this is a wonderful product that I've just discovered that actually, in my managed services world, where I run a small MSP, and my director of managed services added this application as sort of an extra add-on to Office 365. And I absolutely love it, because it breaks down exactly why it thinks that this is a spam email. Now, again, if the first layer is human, if you're in a role that can be determined within the attacking by the attacker, such as payroll, this kind of targeted attack, payroll or something like purchasing, this targeted attack would work on possibly executives, but certainly on some particular departments. Now, I love the way it identifies why it thinks that this is a non-legit email, and it breaks it down for you. And I can't think of any more powerful way to reinforce that cybersecurity awareness training for particular departments and give them examples of the type of attacks that you've suffered, or that you know about. I think it's a really powerful way of developing a culture of awareness within the organization. And of course, here's a couple of other things that I've come across. Have I been pwned? Everybody's domain needs to be in that, and everybody's personal email addresses need to be into that. You will be surprised at how many data breaches you've been victimized. You will be surprised at how many email accounts may have been compromised in your own organization. This is something you should be checking regularly. You can also configure it to send you an email if there's a new data breach that is uploaded into Have I Been Pwned system, which is basically run by an amazing human being who I know fairly well, Troy Hunt, who's a legend in cybersecurity, and is just presenting us with a huge service. And many ransomware operators who have stolen business data, when their servers are compromised, The FBI and Europol will upload that data to Have I Been Pwned so that anyone that is on that system can get a notification that their email and maybe some of their sensitive information has appeared in this recent data breach. So it's a really great resource. The other one that I've been really starting to look at for users especially, right, is the juxtaposition between scams that will likely target them as individuals or in their role as business functionary people. Scams can do as much damage to your organization as things like business email compromise. So part of this awareness culture is to move from the once a year boring PowerPoint to continuous reinforcement without being too invasive. I'm not a huge fan of phishing emails internally and using that as a metric. I would prefer organizations to be looking at the number of tickets where a suspected event has occurred and how that event was either proved to be a false positive or was actually at early stages of an attack. I understand this compliance requirement for awareness training. So I'm not saying get rid of it, but constantly reinforce it and making people aware of the types of scams and the types of cyber attacks that your organization can face is all part of a really proactive approach that can be driven by the organization. Now, this is kind of where the next shoe drops, is the belief in the organizational security capability. I can hear the laughter right now from IT and cybersecurity people, okay? I need you guys to drop the cynicism for a moment, okay? And understand that there's a larger picture here. And the first is we want to provide a safe working environment and have a duty of care to our employees. So rather than basically being in the kind of right quadrant here of anxiety, worry, doubt, and danger, and trying to educate our users and make them paranoid, is really adopt a philosophy of learning, experience, growth, and opportunity when it comes to, the early stages or a security event or failure of something. Everybody gets owned at some point, okay? I've been personally owned. Businesses that I've worked for have been owned. Targeted attacks occur. Individuals have experienced, a cyber attack or a social engineering attack. Everyone can succumb to it just because of the huge volume. It's like there's two philosophies. I can be a sniper and shoot one bullet, or I can just spray and pray and maybe somebody will get tagged, right? Both are legitimate tactics here. But I think what we need to do is embrace the idea that a cybersecurity event is primarily a learning experience, growth, and opportunity to educate. And if it's showing that seems to be kind of a regular occurrence, all of this information should be compiled into a business case to deal with whatever issue that you're having. And two-way communication is critical. When users make reports, follow up. Don't just give them the idea that when the report is made, there's, that's job done for the security team. It's not. Talk to the person, assure them that you've got the situation under control. That's all part of it, right? What's one of the first things you say to your comrade, even if it's really bad? It's going to be okay. We're going to get you sorted out. We're going to get you fixed up. Okay. The other thing too, and I see this quite a bit, is the clear business goal of the organization linked to the measurable business value supported by the security program. The security program is like the third stool for any organization in my appreciation. Okay. And when you kick out that leg of the stool, man, it's really hard to balance on it. And I did a tweet today. You can follow me on Twitter at @fat_hobbit. It was today or yesterday, where I said, if your whole value proposition of your organization is to protect sensitive data, i.e. 23andMe, okay, Don't be surprised when the company valuation goes from $6 billion on the stock exchange to almost being delisted on the stock exchange. So really think about that and underscore that in how you're going to communicate the security program's goals, how they're linked to the business value of the organization, and how they support growth and opportunity. This is critical to get that near 100% buy-in from your user community, right? Document processes and change control to eliminate surprises. IT people, IT security people, even users don't like surprises, okay? So this is really critical in being able to do that feedback loop. Never reboot a user's computer remotely without telling them that you're rebooting it, because it's scary for that end user. It will create anxiety. It will create a mistrust. They won't understand what is going on. So in order to build, and I said this two-way communication is critical in building that culture of belief in the organization's security capability. It's all about that two-way communication is critical. And training and experience for everyone every day, okay? And that training and experience can be passing on a tip, a security awareness tip of the week or something like that. Or, if you do have an incident, tell the organization about how it happened, why it happened, and what can be done to stop it from happening in the future. These stories are really important. And if you have that culture of the safe working environment for cyber and a duty of care for your employees when it comes to cybersecurity incidents, you're going a long way step forward in supporting your users, right? And I write about this a lot, right? The cyber first aid, the belief in the leadership is about your team, your IT team, your security team, and its commitment to deliver better every day, right? Appreciate the value of each employee and their experience and capabilities that they bring to their business, right? In the midst of a cybersecurity incident, the employee needs to be supported, especially if they're patient zero of a problem, okay? Period. So bury the grudges, bury the desire to get even because maybe they're a complete bastard to you before. Be professional, right? Be customer service focused on outcomes when it comes to somebody having their worst day of their career. And again, focus on the proactive action that you can take. It's often the least expensive and least stressful action to take because information is security, right? Knowing about attacks that happen on your organization becomes a critical way of mediating those attacks. Now, here's some other things on the caution side, okay? Now, the caution side is sort of like, it's a blend of both the idea being that anything that you're not 100% sure of in terms of a procedure or requests that's been made and you've never done it before or it's new, right? Immediately elevate that to your management, to the security team. This is not weakness. This is not a situation where you go to somebody and say, listen, I feel uncomfortable telling them about this phone call I got or a fax that I received or people send faxes still, if you can believe it, right? Or some check that they wanted me to destroy or put into a different thing or an employee's banking change or a supplier's banking change. These are the kind of stuff that in your organization, you want your users to do two things, okay? So identify and look out for those persuasion techniques used by scammers. And that's why the constant reinforcement, there's lots of different ones, scam busters, abuse, things like that, that can help continuously inform your organization about the types of attacks that it will be facing and your users, right? Because sometimes users are using both their at-home asset as well as their actual business asset. A lot of people interchange that stuff, especially in this small, medium business world. It's critical that the person is trained to start making notes of the telephone conversation and identifiable information, because if you're about to get hit by some really carefully crafted Beck or multi-layered fraud, which I've actually investigated, and it blew my mind. This was literally an impersonation of a court with a bailiff arriving at the business, looking to basically seize property unless an invoice is paid. The hysteria and sense of urgency there that caused the organization to actually authorize payment. And again, very important. This is for your frontline people more than anything else. The ones that interact with the public is the staff who take external calls are aware of these business scams and share any historical examples with all new employees. Okay, so I work for a pretty top tier cyber threat intelligence company. We're bespoke in that we do a lot of customization of our platform for customers, right? A new employee puts out on their LinkedIn profile that they've just joined the company. And within about 72 hours of that LinkedIn posting going up, that person was contacted by our CEO, and they tried to do the gift cards scam on the CEO, the threat actor, with that brand new employee. So this is where IT security can take 10 minutes to just send an email to the new employee. And new employees are going to read anything that comes into their inbox, right? They're hungry to get involved. They feel like they have to check all of these boxes. They have to do their onboarding. They have to set up their banking information. If IT security, I'm telling you right now, is there within that golden hour, I love this, right? You're going to be able to head off that potential for, basically emergency cyber surgery to repair some sort of data breach, okay? So have your own SLA. Maybe 1 hour is too aggressive, right? It's not aggressive if stuff is coming out of you and you need that put back in, right? Or there's something in you and it's got to come out. But in both cases here, what we're really talking about is educating the person that's saying, hey, we love social media and we're excited that you're going to support our company with social media. But beware that when you do your employment update, it might be, you might get targeted by scammers. And some of the most popular scams that are in, cycle today are here. You can find more information, and please contact security 24/7 for any issue that you might think, right? Now, people coming in where it's their first job may not have a wealth of security knowledge or have been in the business environment long. But folks that have moved around from other organizations, right? If any of them have ever had a negative experience with security or IT, try to undo that negative experience. Overachieve on the customer service side. Build that relationship within your organization. Because if you get the heads up from a person that got your golden hour cybersecurity email right at the beginning of their career saying, oh, by the way, this might come at you, right? Depending on how big your public profile is. Or maybe wait 3 months as a policy, right? Once you're past probation, and we've had a chance to go through all the security awareness training before updating your LinkedIn profile. There's a bunch of different ways that you can attack this particular problem. And some of it can be policy-based. Others can be just education and getting there early before, that the casualty becomes, a deceased, right? Now, this is, again, just underscoring a lot of what I'm saying is that irregular activity on the computer itself, weird reboots, blue screens, things like that, bring it to the attention of the IT team, which then can, if that's integrated with security, great. But if not, the IT team needs to triage and send it over security as a high priority. Because these virulent strains of ransomware can knock out subnets pretty quickly if the vulnerability that they're exploiting is widespread, okay? This is sort of moving beyond, the SIEM picking up a compromise and a bunch of MITRE attack table steps that are happening against your organization. This is more of the smash and grab type of cybersecurity incident, right? So I think there's a real important lesson here to understand is that security and IT team, especially help desk, really needs to be in sync and really needs to have fast levels of communication. Now, again, computers should be isolated so they can be they can, I think that word's supposed to be accessed by the IT team if there's a suspected compromise or even the end user, depending on their capabilities. Okay. So some people, if they're on a workstation, will unplug the wall, but a lot of this stuff, guys, is now wireless access. And, you know, basically you're going to have to be able to go in there, identify the asset, possibly from the, you know, whatever management platform you have, and maybe push that computer into a different VLAN to isolate it from the rest of the organization. And again, notify all the employees and provide limited details about the attack or infection, right? That's critical to let people know that there has been a potential breach and that you're investigating it, right? Super important. Now, I'm just going to go and throw out there a couple of other things that come into the equation here of education for users. Okay, it's really important to be able to provide them information about where they're going and how that might affect their IT experiences. Nigeria, as far as I'm concerned, is a bad place to go for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the 3 terrorist organizations that are working in that country. But a lot of people, especially in the oil industry and not-for-profit organizations, have to go there. So again, you should be, the IT department, the security department, the first stop for information about international travel and data security for the organization. And again, this comes down to finding the right information about what kind of actor may be targeting your organization. You know, the standard CRINC organization, as I like to call it, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, they are after certain things and they are conducting certain operations within their cyber forces. So this is also a factor, especially if you're part of any sort of government supply chain at any level. The other thing to understand and educate, and I'm pointing you to really good resources here, is of course the Verizon Data Breach 2023. We certainly use that to construct threat models and understand the type of actors, the type of compromises they've suffered, of course, the number of incidents and the kind of the motives of what they're particular after. So if you want to customize your cybersecurity awareness training, pick the industry vertical that fits your industry vertical from the Verizon Data Breach Report and make sure everybody has this information in your organization. Now, I'm just going to say things will go wrong. You're going to get into some real Black Hawk Down situations, okay? And all sorts of different types of cybersecurity events can happen. But we come down, and what we really do is we think of being the most available and customer serviced organization ever. This is an example of a United Kingdom's campaign. It's going on today, but it's about seeing stuff, saying stuff to the right, maybe the IT department here, and then getting it sorted. They use the word sorted in the UK to indicate that the issue or problem has been fixed. So now it comes to my favorite part about the advice and help, where we reach out to you, our audience, who have obviously followed our sponsors on LinkedIn. That's Lacework and Beyond Trust. And I'm now going to get the tough questions from Brian. Or no, from Chris.
Hey, yeah, from Chris. Thanks for the plug in our great sponsors. Yeah, let's jump in. We got quite a few good ones. Let's kick it off with a question from Bradford. What steps are necessary to clear and or clean the reputation of an email address or domain?
Yeah, so I think when the organization is really setting up, and I've seen some really neat stuff on this, when one user whitelists an organization, right, it actually has one user whitelists an email address from an organization. it actually will take that information and whitelist it for all users in the organization. So it rapidly learns what is legitimate email coming into the organization, and then will allow that to be delivered sort of with not being molested. Maybe they're, as much. So if it was on the edge and the system decides that, no, it looks a little bit suspicious, right? There's also ones that are doing it on volumetrics as well too, which means if, like, for instance, at the beginning of the month, 19 or 20 supplier invoices arrive regularly, the next couple of times that happens, it automatically pushes you through. There's lots of great third-party tools. This is an area that I think has seen a massive impact from machine learning and AI, and of course the full support of Microsoft and Google, because actually phishing is still ranked as the #1 attack vector. However, what we're seeing is the phishing might be for credentials, which of course opens up the whole discussion of multi-factor authentication protection and why that should be mandatory.
On that note, Laura wants to know the flip side of that. My email is not being received by some users and or domains. Do you have a cheat sheet for probable causes?
Yeah. So what happens in a lot, and this is the sort of the other side of the story when it comes to phishing defenses. If your email is not set up right? So DMARC, right? The proper DNS entries, this sender policy, SPF entries, all of these things will make your email look kind of dodgy, right? And that dodginess might be enough to push it over. Like, for instance, if it's got a lot of HTML content in, a lot of people like to add HTML pictures and things like that into the contact and put in a bunch of links. So for me right now, I think I'm seeing it from the perspective of your email may not be set up properly. And for instance, if you're using a third party to send out third-party marketing emails, the SPF entries have to be right, because if not, it'll look and say, well, why is a server that has nothing to do with the domain and IP address is a totally crazy one? Why is it sending email that looks like an impersonation? We actually, little quick story, we, as in our organization, hired a third-party marketing firm who started sending out emails on behalf. That's done quite often. But a cybersecurity company in Israel hit me up on LinkedIn and said, dude, like, somebody's impersonating your organization. They hadn't told me, the CISO, that they had an active marketing campaign going. So, yeah, I mean, blue on blue, right?
Mm. Paul chimes in with a great question. To what extent can AI or automation pick up the slack of whatever end users feel they can't do or won't do to minimize ransomware risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where so I've heard it both sides, right? Department of Homeland Security had basically said, that's Jen Easterly, the AI is going to give an advantage to these hackers. Kevin Mandian basically said there's going to be a huge opportunity for AI and machine learning to help the defenders. I think because AI and machine learning has been in the hands of cybersecurity tool makers for quite some time, I think we're going to get that next generation of products that leverages AI and ML, because we have this one piece of such great threat intelligence, and it's the MITRE attack table. And if you can see the 2 or 3 early stages developing in a cyber attack in MITRE, that will give you the early warning and the ability to respond faster than the bad guys can kind of cycle through a departure from the attack, right? Like, basically it's looking for and predicting what's going to happen next after it sees something strange that looks like initial access.
Okay, great. Here's a follow-up to something you touched on. What are your thoughts on when law enforcement does get involved?
Wow, that is the double-edged sword of double-edged swords. Listen, first of all, law enforcement needs to be involved when your counsel tells you that law enforcement needs to be involved, Okay, so this is not an IT decision. This is a business decision. It has to be made at the highest levels of your organization, right? So your idea of reaching out to your local FBI and calling them in without getting sign off from your senior executives is you're going to have a bad day. Okay, but I will say this: it can be of great benefit, and we've seen it of great benefit in the Kaseya incident. In that they basically said, we're in super deep, we're way out of our depth here. FBI, come help us, right? And the FBI did a great job, helped them a lot, and retrieved some of the ransom that I believe they were forced to pay, right? So there can be great benefit, but I think it has to scale to the size of business impact, right? And how grievous the potential injury has been to your organization, right? And then I think that's an executive decision that is way out of your hands, even at the CISO level. I wouldn't make that call. I'd make recommendations, but I would never make that call on my own. That's way above a pay grade, I think.
Okay, great. Let's get a couple more questions in here before the end of the session.
Yeah.
Paul chimes in with a great question / comments. Can helping employees with burnout and related issues on the job help them to be more alert and hands-on in minimizing ransomware risks?
100%. And this goes back to what I was, smashing away at here, is that having that safe working environment where things are a learning opportunity will make a more dedicated employee, because they're going to know that they screwed up maybe, or they're going to know that they got hoodwinked. And people get really mad, right? Especially when they've been scammed or done something that was wrong, and now they find out that it had some repercussion. You can build the most loyal and dedicated employee by treating them when they're at their worst moments, right? You're always going to remember the person that pulls you out of the house of the burning fire, right? You're always gonna remember the person that donated an organ to save you, right? So this is the same psychological triggers I think you can do by really being aware of it and helping those employees out that are just having the absolute worst day.
Okay, here's a great question. I appreciate your use of the VDBR 2023 for a relevant threat model. What are the sources you have to share with us?
Yeah, so I'll give you a caveat first. I'm always a little bit shy of vendor reports, okay? Because vendor reports can be a little bit biased, and sometimes they're blatantly biased, okay? But various government reports and think tank assessments and CISA, of course, as well as CISI, which is another think tank that occasionally does great presentations, but more at a strategic and threat level. And also the stories literally that you get at regional and global cybersecurity conferences from great speakers and presenters that are out there that walk you through how they responded to an incident. Transparency is our only hope. When we just get the K-8 filing to say we suffered a cybersecurity incident and we now have to pay $50 million, and there's no details on what happened, and there's no details on how the threat actors, and it all kind of filters out in little bite-sized chunks to the media. This is the most destructive thing you can do to your brand, right? Things like announcing you're spending $25 million on remediation, no one cares. They just need to know that their stuff is safe. And when you say things like we're spending $25 million on remediation publicly, one begs the question, why didn't you spend it before you lost all my data, right? So this is where I think the communications aspect to this kind of data breach announcements and remediation efforts requires a level of transparency, because if you're really going to be part of this community, if you're really going to help out your brothers and sisters working in this industry, you need to be able to tell the story. Now, whether or not that's in, kind of an isolated, environment where there's a level of trust, like InfoGuard in the FBI. If you're not part of InfoGuard, you should join InfoGuard, so that you can get those kind of real life stories, take them back, maybe sanitize a little bit, because in the keepings of stuff under what we call Chatham House rules, right? But you can use it as lessons learned for your own organization, right? To protect it from the mistake or the unfortunate event that occurred, right next door to you in your supply chain.
And with that, we are out of time for this first session. Thanks for the great presentation, Ian.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure. And if I can just tell you, if you thought mine was good, just wait till Brian comes at you.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be an awesome presentation to follow up on yours. Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Strategies for Implementing Simulation Training with Brian Posey. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Lacework and Beyond Trust, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to our speakers, as well as today's sponsors, Lacework and Beyond Trust, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director at Redmond Magazine, and I'm so excited to moderate our second session of our ransomware training summit. This session is called Strategies for Implementing Simulation Training. And you're in for a treat, as Ian and Chris indicated at the last session. Today's speaker for the second session is Brian Posey. Brian is a freelance tech writer, a 22-time Microsoft MVP, and a prolific writer of IT books, video training courses, and blog posts. If you check out redmondmag.com, there's a huge archive of Brian Posey how-to articles under the, I think it's called Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. You're in for a treat. Like I said, Brian, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Gladys. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about all kinds of fun stuff. Phishing messages, ransomware simulation training, all kinds of things like that. Before I jump into it, I just want to say that I caught about the last 20 minutes of the previous session, and absolutely great stuff. Ian did a fantastic job. And there was one point that he made that I'm not going to bring it up quite yet, but I'm so glad that he made it because it's actually something that I had planned on talking about a little bit later in my presentation. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. One of the things that I find perhaps the most interesting about phishing attacks is that they never seem to go away. I mean, if you think about way back to the early 90s, phishing attacks existed back then. Now, they weren't called phishing attacks at the time, but they absolutely existed. And I can't tell you the number of times over the years that I've heard different industry leaders say, oh, we're going to put an end to spam, we're going to put an end to phishing attacks because we've got this new technology that's going to be able to detect it better and eliminate it, so this will be a problem of the past. And even after all of these years, we're talking about 30-plus years here, the problem still exists. Some of the attacks that we see today are almost identical to the ones from way back when, but of course, we see new and unique attacks every day. The one thing that I've really learned over the years is that cyber criminals will go to absolutely any length that they have to go to victimize someone. Absolutely nothing is beneath them. So how far will they go? Well, let me show you on this next slide. And before I reveal the slide, let me just say that what you're about to see is 100% real. So this is an email that I received, and the first thing you'll probably notice is that I've redacted big portions of it. And the reason why I've redacted this isn't because I've got something to hide or anything like that. It's just to protect the privacy of the people involved. Because what this particular cyber criminal did was they went and they pulled a real obituary off of the internet, and then they embedded a couple of malicious links, and then sent it out to anybody that they thought might fall for it. So think about this for a second. In addition to being pure evil, this is one of those things that people are very likely to fall for because their guard's let down. I mean, put yourself in the position of someone who receives an email like this. Imagine for a moment that a friend, relative, loved one, or someone close to you ended up passing away and you received a copy of their obituary by email. You probably wouldn't suspect anything. I know I wouldn't. When I received this, thankfully, there were some telltale clues and I didn't fall for this and click on anything that I shouldn't. But this is one of those things that would be extremely easy for somebody to fall for. And yet, here we have cyber criminals doing this, exploiting someone's death in order to infect someone with malware. So all of this is to underscore the point that cyber criminals will go to absolutely any lengths to victimize someone. So that's all the more reason why you have to take these phishing attacks seriously, in addition to the simple fact that they're the most prolific type of attack that we face today. So how do we deal with this sort of thing? Well, filtering is an absolute must. That's a given. That one's so obvious I'm not even going to be addressing it in this presentation. But the problem with filtering is that it's never going to be 100% effective. There's always going to be something that gets through the filter, and that's what you have to deal with. So what should you do to deal with it? Well, I recommend taking a two-pronged approach. One of those prongs is end-user education, which is something I consider to be extremely important, but also something that's not done nearly enough. And then the other thing is attack simulation training, and I'm going to be talking about both of these. So let's start by talking a little bit about end-user education. When it comes to end-user education, I recommend not underestimating the importance of just having a very frank and detailed conversation with your users and giving them the information that they need in order to be able to avoid these phishing messages. Because remember, your users can benefit from this. Not only are phishing attacks prevalent at work, but this is something that they have to deal with at home too on their personal email accounts. So you're not only helping the company to avoid a massive ransomware attack or something like that, you're also helping your users in their own personal lives to avoid being compromised. Another way to look at this is that it's going to be a whole lot cheaper and a lot easier to educate your users than to clean up the mess following a ransomware attack or some sort of malware attack or other type of security breach. Because anytime that data is disclosed and leaked out on the internet, it's extremely expensive to clean up from that. So it's going to be way cheaper, way easier just to educate your users up front than to have to incur the cost involved in cleaning up from a massive security breach. So another bit of advice that I would give you is to take advantage of all of the various tools that are out there. Yes, I'm talking about attack simulation training, but there are countless other tools available. There are some fantastic resources that are available online that can coach you through the process of avoiding phishing emails and that can help you to get your users trained. So with that said, I'm going to spend the next portion of the presentation talking about some things to look for in phishing messages. Now, I realize that the vast majority of you who are listening are IT professionals, and a lot of this is probably old hat to you, and that's great. That's a fantastic position to be in. The reason why I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over things to look for in phishing emails is two things. One, it's for the benefit of anybody who might be new, but two, and perhaps more importantly, after this presentation is done, all of these slides are going to be available for you to download. I'm not exactly sure where. I'm sure Gladys can fill you in at the end of the presentation, but all of this is going to be available for download. So the content that you'll find in my next several slides are things that you're going to be able to take back and use to develop your own end-user training program. So that's why these are in here. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So every phishing attack, as I'm sure most of you probably already know, consists of two parts. First of all, there's the message, and the message is deceptive by its very nature, and it's designed to trick the recipient into taking some sort of action. And that action is related to the other part of the message, which is the payload. The payload is almost always either going to be a malicious link or it's going to be an attachment. So what I find particularly interesting is that most cyber criminals will go to great lengths to disguise the payload, and that's what I'm going to be showing you is some of the methods that are used for disguising payloads. Every great once in a while, you may find a cyber criminal who gets lazy and does absolutely nothing to disguise the payload. I've certainly seen a couple of examples of that over the years where they don't even try to hide the fact that they're trying to infect you with something. But most of the time, they'll use some sort of obfuscation to disguise the payload and make it seem like something, at the very least, that's harmless, but potentially even beneficial to you. So let's take a look at some examples. One of the big ones, and this is one of those techniques that's been around absolutely forever, but it's still in use today, is fake file extensions. So let me show you how this works. Fake file extensions are something that, to the best of my knowledge, happens primarily in Windows environments, and it takes advantage of the fact that newer Windows operating systems hide file extensions by default. So if you take a look at the slide, you can see that I've got a file called My Document, and there is no extension on that. And the reason why there's no extension is because, as I mentioned, Windows hides file extensions by default. You'll also notice on this slide that there's a big blue arrow pointing to a checkbox for various things that you can do to customize the appearance of File Explorer. So we have item checkboxes, file name extensions, and hidden items. So if you were to select that file name extensions checkbox, then the file name extension would show up. So you can see on this slide what happens when I select that checkbox. All of a sudden, instead of seeing my document, we see my document.txt or .text. Simple enough. So let's take a look at how this gets exploited. Here I have another file called mydocument.txt. Now there are two things that I want to point out about this. First of all, if you look at the blue arrow, you'll notice that the file name extensions checkbox has not been selected. So in creating this particular file, the person's taking advantage of the idea that Windows files can have multiple extensions. Those extensions simply get appended to one another. So in this case, we have mydocument.txt, and then there's presumably something that comes after that that's hidden because file name extensions are turned off. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this slide is the icon, because a lot of times the icon is a dead giveaway as to what you're really dealing with. So if I would go back to the previous slide for a second, take a look at the icon that's associated with mydocument.txt. The file that's shown on this slide is a real text file, and the icon conveys that. If I go to this slide, however, you'll notice that the icon has changed, and now the icon represents an executable. So if we turn on file name extensions, you can see that the full name of this file is actually mydocument.txt.exe. So this is an executable file as opposed to the harmless text file that it masquerades as. So that's just one technique that cyber criminals will sometimes use to disguise payloads. Let's take a look at some others. Another thing that's super common is long domain names. So the basic idea behind this is that a URL is made up of a domain and several different subdomains. So for example, .com would be a top tier domain, and then beneath that you would have typically the organization's name, and then beneath that you might have like www or something like that. But there are any number of different ways that you can construct a domain made up of multiple subdomains. So attackers will often take advantage of this technique and make it look like a URL is going to one place, where in reality it's going to somewhere else. What they will often do is make the domain name so long that they're counting on it being long enough to extend past the visible portion of the address bar in your browser, if that's how you're entering it, or make it look entirely uninteresting within the context of an email, so that you can't tell where this link is really going. Another really common technique is spoofed URLs. And this is one of those things that's super simple to do. If you've ever hyperlinked a piece of text, you know how to do this. All you do is whatever program you're using, you select the word that you want to hyperlink, right-click on it, and then typically there will be an option to hyperlink, and then you type in the URL that you want to use. So what this technique is based on is taking a pure plain text URL and hyperlinking it, but rather than hyperlinking it to the URL that's shown, hyperlinking it to somewhere else. So for example, in this case, I've taken the URL brianposey.com and I've hyperlinked it to poseylab.com. So even though this says brianposey.com, if you clicked on it, it would go to poseylab.com instead. And that's an extremely common technique. And I mentioned how you could do something like this using a text editor. If you're just creating raw HTML, it's even easier to do, because all you have to do is insert a meta tag directing the code where you want the link to go to. Another technique that's often used by cyber criminals is that of shortening URLs. And there are several different services online that will do this for you. The two most common are probably tinyURL or Bitly. The basic idea behind these services, and these are totally legit services, by the way, I shouldn't add that, but the basic idea behind these services is that if you've got a big long URL and you just want to shorten it so that people don't have to type so much text, you can go out to tinyURL or to Bitly, you type your great big long URL, and then they give you another URL that acts as an alias. So this much shorter URL is something that people can use to get to the site that you're trying to direct them to without having to type in the longer URL. And as you can see on the slide, these short URLs are really cryptic in nature. So my long URL example is brianposey.com/space, but the aliases that I generated on that are tinyurl.com/y3lh5ayx and bit.ly/31sxsp3. So the reason why I mention this is because you can't just look at one of these shortened URLs and get a sense of where it goes to. You don't know where this is going to ultimately direct you once you click on one of these URLs. Sure, it's going to go out to tinyurl or to bit.ly, but then from there it's going to get redirected somewhere else. And that somewhere else is a complete mystery. So this is one of those techniques that cyber criminals will very often use. Another really common technique is simple misspellings of URLs. I've given a few examples here, but this is far from being a comprehensive list. In the first example, we have posylabs.com as opposed to posylab.com. So the URL has an extra S. So this looks like the legitimate site, but that one extra character makes all the difference in the world. We also have posylab.com misspelled. You'll notice that posylab.com is missing the E. So a simple misspelling or character omission. Another really common technique that's used is to just transpose two characters. So for example, in my name, Posey, P-O-S-E-Y, they might type P-O-E-S-Y instead as a way of redirecting someone to a different site without them catching the mistake. And then there are also just simple misspellings. For example, my first name is spelled with an E. A cyber criminal might use an A instead of an E as a way of directing someone to a site that's not mine. So those are just a few examples. And then we have hidden URLs. This is a variation of the technique that I talked about earlier, in which a word is hyperlinked and it's directed to a different location. So in this case, I have click here to go to your bank's website, but the word here isn't actually hyperlinked to a bank. It's hyperlinked to a different destination. And the way that you would detect this is to simply hover your mouse over top of the hyperlink, and that will show you where the URL actually goes to. And that was the case with the example that I gave before as well. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of with regard to this technique is that it's not always applied just to text. The same basic technique can also be applied to things like buttons. So let me show you a real-world example of this. Here we have a URL that I received probably a couple of weeks, or excuse me, an email that I received probably a couple of weeks ago. And this email claims to be from DocuSign. And at first glance, it legitimately looks like it's from DocuSign. There are a few things that are a dead giveaway within this email. But the one thing that I really wanted to point out more than anything else is that there's a great big button that says View Document. And if you hover the mouse over top of the button, you can see that the URL that's associated with that button doesn't point to DocuSign. Instead, it goes to some really obscure URL, r20.rs6.net, whatever that is. So clearly, this is a malicious message. So what are some other giveaways that were in this indicating that this message probably wasn't from DocuSign? Well, for one thing, the simple fact that I wasn't expecting anything from DocuSign. Typically, when someone sends you a document that they want you to sign, they'll let you know about it ahead of time. And I didn't receive any such notification. So that's one tip-off. But another tip-off is just a few things that exist within this message. For example, there's an option to translate message to English, and then there's also a link, never translate from Dutch. I don't know anybody who speaks Dutch that would be sending me a document to sign, so that's kind of a giveaway too. Also, if you look at who it's from, it's coming from peaksepticandutilities.com. So that sender is also kind of a giveaway. Not that they're necessarily rogue or something like that, but clearly this document spoofed the sender, or clearly this email spoofed the sender rather. So what else? The next example says vague attachments. The slide should probably say vague emails and attachments, because one of the techniques that's often used is that of just making a message so vague that the recipient doesn't really know what to do with it, and so they kind of get curious and click on something that they shouldn't. So in this case, and this is a real email, the subject, ACH confirmation attached. For those who aren't familiar with ACH, I believe it stands for Automated Clearinghouse, and the idea is that there's some sort of electronic payment that's been made, and this email is apparently the confirmation of that. But you'll notice that there's absolutely no text in the email telling the person what to do. The only thing in there is an attachment, and that attachment is an HTML document. So if someone were to click on this attachment, it would open up their browser and direct them to who knows where, presumably to some malicious site. But the point being that this message is so incredibly vague that they're counting on the idea that whoever receives it is going to have questions. They're not going to know if this is actually an ACH confirmation or not, and they might think that they should open up this attachment just to be sure. So that's one of the things that you've really got to educate your end users about. So let's talk about some of the different payload types. There are any number of different types, and this is by no means an all-inclusive list. If we were to talk about all of them, I would probably burn up every bit of time that I've got just talking about the various types of payloads. So at the top of the list, we have ransomware. Ransomware has become somewhat of a generic term over the years because there are so many different types of ransomware. So the next thing on the list is ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service is something that's come about, I don't know, maybe in about the last 5 years. The idea is that there are cyber criminals out there who want to launch ransomware attacks but don't have the skill to create ransomware themselves. So what they do is they go out to the dark web, and there are providers that offer ransomware as a service. So in other words, it's do-it-yourself ransomware. The cyber criminal goes out to one of these sites, they fill in a few fields, and then this site spits out ransomware that's custom tailored to their specifications. And the way that this works is that they can use this ransomware to infect anybody they want and to extort payment, and then the author of that ransomware kit ends up getting a portion of any ransoms that are paid. So that's one way that cyber criminals are launching ransomware attacks when they might not necessarily have the skill to do so otherwise. Then we have crypto ransomware. Crypto ransomware is probably the type of ransomware that we're all the most familiar with. This is the type that goes in and encrypts all of your files and then demands a ransom in exchange for a decryption key. The next one on the list is scareware. And this one might be best summed up as ransomware that's not real. So you might think, why in the world would anybody create ransomware that's not real? Well, there are any different number of reasons. One is you might have a cyber criminal who wants to launch a ransomware attack, but they don't really know how, so they create fake ransomware. I've also seen scareware created for training purposes. I myself have created scareware on occasion, not to unleash on the world, but just for my own purposes. For some of the documentation that I've created or things like that, I don't really want to mess around with real ransomware, so I'll create something that looks like ransomware just so that I can handle it safely. Then we have lockers. This is very similar to crypto ransomware in that it locks up a file in some way so that a person has to pay a ransom in order to gain access to their data. So these lockers, sometimes they'll use encryption. They go in and encrypt all the files just like crypto ransomware would. In other times, or in other cases, they might set up a encrypted vault and then actually move all of the files into that vault. And then you have to pay to get the password that would open that vault. So there are a million different variations of this. Another one is doxware. This is more of a cyber extortion type scheme where the cyber criminal threatens to expose personal details unless a ransom is paid. As a matter of fact, I know someone personally who was just a victim of this very recently. And then the last one on the list is leakware. And this is somewhat similar to doxware, except rather than threatening to leak personal details, the cyber criminal is in possession of data and they're threatening to expose the organization's most intimate secrets on the internet unless they pay a ransom. So let's talk a little bit about phishing attacks. Again, there are a countless variety of phishing attacks out there, but let's talk about some of the more common ones. And incidentally, over about the next three screens, the screen captures that you'll see all came from the Microsoft 365 attack simulation tool. So the first one on the list is pandemic-related scams. And we're not seeing this one quite as often anymore, but it's still out there. The idea is that the cyber criminal will create an email posing typically as either a government agency or as the company that a particular person works for, and they'll say something like, hey, there's huge benefits that are available to you, but in order to claim these benefits, we need you to click here and provide a few personal details. Then we have brand impersonation messages. In this particular example, there's a message that claims to come from Apple, and they're asking the person to log in to their Apple account and provide some details. There are a million variations on this one. I've even seen emails in the real world that claim to come from companies like Coca-Cola or Microsoft saying that, hey, you've won the Coca-Cola lottery. Click here to claim your prize. Or, really bizarre things like that. The next thing that we have is shipping scams. And there are a lot of different varieties of this one. In this particular case, this is posing as a DHL parcel tracker. And the text of the email just says the document's been made available via email attachment as requested by the sender, content of parcel, shipping documents, click here to download. So the idea being that you click on a link thinking that you're going to download shipping details, and instead you get infected with malware. What I've seen more commonly in the real world rather than this, because again, this does come from the Microsoft attack simulation tool, what I've seen more commonly in the real world is a fake email that claims to come from UPS or FedEx or something like that, and says package is out for delivery today. Here's the tracking number, and oh, by the way, click here if you want to see the tracking details. And things like that you have to really be careful with, because a lot of times those messages look completely authentic. And I can't speak for any of you, but I tend to have a lot of packages delivered, and so I get UPS tracking details several times a week, and sometimes it's tough to know for sure whether one of those messages is actually from UPS or if it's one of these phishing emails. Oftentimes there are subtle telltale signs that you can use to tell the difference. But the best rule of thumb is if you're not sure, just don't click on anything. Then we have urgent messages. And again, these take on a million different forms. In this case, this message is your license plate number will expire soon. So they're trying to prompt the recipient of the message into taking some sort of action. The recipient will get this message and think, oh, my plates on my car are about to expire. I've got to renew this, and they may click on the link without even thinking about it. And then on the last couple, we have rewards programs. So you've been selected by the Fair Price Rewards Program. Honestly, I'm not familiar with Fair Price. I don't even know if that's a real thing or not. And then we also have invoices, and this is another really common one. So this example email has a subject line of remittance advice, which usually means that someone has paid you. And then it has text that within the body of the message saying, you've received a payment from so-and-so, click here to get the details. So these are just a sampling of some of the types of phishing messages that get directed at end users every single day. But as I mentioned, this is far from being a comprehensive list. There are plenty of other types of attacks. We have things like CEO fraud, where a message will appear to come from an organization's CEO and be sent out to the entire company. There are also account compromise attacks. And again, these take on lots of different forms, but this might be something like trying to capture a user's credentials so that you can log in as them. Data theft. And there are a lot of different ways of doing data theft, but if we're talking about email, then one of the more common methods is to either compromise an account so that you can log in as an end user, or just spoof that user's email address, send a message to somebody else in the company and say, oh, hey, by the way, can you send me such and such file? I need that for my records. And then try to gain access to data that way. And then there's also attorney impersonation. Somebody sends out an email message claiming to be an attorney working for the company that they work for and requesting access to certain data or asking personal questions. It's kind of a social engineering scam. But this is one of those things that's been showing up quite a bit more in the real world recently. So here's an example of one of these types of attacks. Here's a message, and this is a type that I've been seeing a whole lot recently. So here's a message claiming to come from Bank of America. And it says, Bank of America guard shared an item. And it says, Bank of America has shared the following item, and then there's a button that you can click to open it. But if you look at the sender details on this, it says Bank of America guard via Google Drive. Now, I'm not a Bank of America customer. I don't really know how they do things, but I'm guessing they probably don't send out documents via Google Drive and ask their customers to open them. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. So what are some other potential messages that you might see? One is pretexting, and we've covered this one several times, and that's a message looks like it's from somebody that you know. So spoofing the sender's email address. Then we have fake extortion or blackmail messages. These are messages like, hey, I've got some sort of dirt on you, and if you don't pay up, I'm going to let the world know, when in reality, they don't actually have anything that they can use for extortion purposes. They're bluffing, hoping that somebody will pay up. And I've seen quite a few examples in the real world of this. I once had a friend, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to accidentally give away confidential information, but I had a friend who called me in an absolute panic one day because he received one of these messages, and the person that he got that message from was claiming to expose all of the stuff about him if he didn't pay up. And it just so happened that in that message they had managed to guess some of the details of his personal life and got these things correct. So he assumed that the message was real. When it comes to fake extortion or blackmail messages, the one thing to look for that you can use to figure out if it's a credible threat or not is what proof are they giving you? Because typically, if a cyber criminal does have something incriminating on you, they're going to use that as leverage. Remember, their goal is to scare you so much that you feel like you don't have any choice but to pay up. So they're going to show you the proof. That's a given. If they just say, hey, I've got all of this, but they don't actually show you any of it, well, then that's probably a good indication that it's a fake extortion or blackmail scam. And then the last one on the list is deepfakes. Now, I have to admit that I didn't really take this one as being a credible threat in the past, but I was talking to someone in my family over the holidays. And again, I don't want to say too much at the risk of exposing this person, but someone had managed to compromise their Facebook account, got a hold of a bunch of personal details, and managed to create a rather disturbing deepfake video of them, and then threatened to send that video out to everyone in their contacts list. The person involved in this told me that the deepfake video didn't look 100% real, but it was real enough that anybody who casually looked at it without trying to scrutinize the video would absolutely fall for it. So apparently the deepfakes that are out there are getting better, and this is something that cyber criminals are actively engaging in. So how can we summarize all of this advice for your end users? Well, there are a few things that the Federal Trade Commission provides as advice to end users. So they say, and this is a direct quote from their website, a message from a scammer might say they've noticed some suspicious activity or login attempts. They haven't. They might claim there is a problem with your account or your payment information. There isn't. They say they need to confirm some personal or financial information. You don't. They might include an invoice you don't recognize. It's fake. They might want you to click on a link to make a payment, but the link has malware. They might say you're eligible to register for a government refund. It's a scam. Or they might offer a coupon for free stuff. It's not real. So just some things that you might pass on to your end users. So what are the most obvious characteristics of a phishing message? Well, some of the more prevalent ones are things like poorly constructed sentences, bad grammar, misspellings, and then implausible situations. I'm talking about some of the ones that have gone on absolutely forever, where someone will claim to be from a government agency and say you owe money to the IRS or the Social Security Administration, or pick your agency of choice, and we want you to pay that overdue bill with Amazon gift cards or Apple gift cards or something like that. You know, things that are totally implausible that would never happen in the real world, and yet there are scammers out there that try that. And unfortunately, there are victims who fall for that. So let's talk about attack simulation training. For anybody who's not familiar with the concept of attack simulation training, it's essentially using a tool to create a benign but realistic-looking phishing message and direct it at your users as a teaching tool, so that way you can help them to more readily be able to spot real phishing messages. So the tool that I'm going to be using throughout the rest of this presentation is the Microsoft Attack Simulation tool. That's included with Microsoft Office 365 E5, and there's a trial version of it with the E3 subscription, but I think you only get access to one message in the E3 version. So let's take a look at this tool. So this is the dashboard that appears when you first open up the tool. And there are a few things going on here. First of all, we have an overview that shows the recent simulations that you've run. There's also some recommendations. You can see the simulation coverage and the training that's been completed by your end users. But what I found more interesting is that down at the bottom, we have a list of repeat offenders, so people who have fallen for multiple fake phishing attacks. And these are the users that you probably want to target more heavily for training. And then we also have behavior impact on compromise rate. So what that means is that, okay, the first time you run a tool, or run a simulation, you'll probably have quite a few people fall for it. The next time, hopefully, they've learned their lesson and fewer people will click on it. So the way that the dashboard interprets that is that users are gradually becoming less susceptible to falling for these attacks, and they provide various metrics for quantifying that susceptibility. So here we see the dashboard simulation tab, and you can see one simulation that I've run in the past. So you can see the number of simulations that are completed, the number in progress, the ones that are scheduled to run in the future, and then other details such as failed simulations, canceled simulations, and draft simulations. So when you do set up a simulation, the first thing that you have to do is tell the tool what type of attack you want to perform. And I can't remember if I said this a moment ago or not, but there are various third-party tools out there that will also do attack simulation training, and they all offer slightly different options, but generally you are going to have the ability to pick the type of attack that you want to direct at the end users. So here we have a few of the choices, things like credential harvesting, malware attachments, a link in the attachment, a link to malware, drive-by URLs, and the list goes on and on. So you would choose the type of attack that you want to perform, and again, these are all benign. They're not actually going to inflict any harm on anyone. And then once you've selected the attack type that you want to perform, you're given a great big long list of messages that you can use as a part of that attack, or you can compose your own message. So you have the ability to preview these messages to see what they look like. And as you can see from the screen capture, these previews are designed to mimic what you would see in the real world. So we have a message, recent server update. Kindly update to the latest security update to enhance your email functionality. Update now. And then be aware that Office 365 will not be responsible for any loss of data should this warning be neglected. So we have all of the various signs of fraud in this message, and this does mimic something that you would probably run into in the real world. So the next thing that you have to do is decide what's going to happen if someone falls for this phishing message that you're sending out. What do you want to do? Do you want to assign training to them? Do you want to ignore it? You have options. And so you can assign this training to all of your users, those who have clicked on the payload, those who are deemed to have been compromised. And then from there, you can select the training module that you want to use. So generally, with the Microsoft tool, it will provide recommendations as to what training it thinks that the user should see based on the type of phishing attack that they've fallen for. But one of the things that I find especially interesting about this particular screen is that you'll notice that there's an option to redirect to a custom URL. And the reason why I like that is because, one, it gives you the opportunity to provide your own training modules as opposed to using the Microsoft ones. Because a lot of the Microsoft training modules, while they might be effective, they tend to be like 2 or 3 minutes in length. They're not very long at all. So it's something that a user could open up, click through, and easily forget about. So if you have more comprehensive training that you would like the user to engage in, you can use this redirect to a custom URL option. And there's one other potential use for the redirection that I'll talk about at the very end of the presentation. So the next thing that we see is what happens when a user falls for the phishing attack. What are they going to see when they click on the link? So the default is they get a message that looks just like this one that says, it's okay, you're human, let's learn from this. And then there's a section, learn what you missed. And then once the user sees what it is that they messed up on in the training or in that message, then they'll be taken to the mandatory training that you've assigned. So this is what it looks like when the simulation walks them through what they missed in the message. So in this case, we can see that there is URL hyperlinking, and it says URL hyperlinking hides the true URL behind the text. The text can also look like another link. And then we also have lack of sender details. The message includes few details about the sender, such as contact information. And then there are a few other things that I didn't end up capturing in screen captures. So then the user ends up receiving an email that looks like this one that tells them that they have a training course to complete. And as you can see, this kind of underscores the point that I was making a minute ago, that these training courses are super short. This one is estimated to take 3 minutes. And this is kind of what the training looks like that the end user engages in. It's done cartoon style so as to not be overly intimidating or anything like that. And it presents the end user with a situation and then asks them what they think they should do. So as we talk about simulation training, there are a few things to consider. One of the biggest considerations, I would even go so far as to say the biggest considerations, is what should the consequences be if a user falls for a simulated phishing attack? And adding to that, what should those consequences be if the user falls for an attack more than once? Now, at the very beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that in the earlier presentation, Ian had made a point that I really wanted to expand on. And Ian's point was that when somebody falls for a phishing attack and they unleash malware, they know they've screwed up. They feel really bad about it. They're probably a little bit nervous, not knowing what's going to happen to them. And Ian made the point that you can really win them over by showing kindness to that person. And I could not agree more with that statement. I talked to somebody in the not too distant past who was setting up a simulation for their organization. And they said, okay, if somebody falls for it once, they'll get a warning message from HR. If they fall for it twice, they're out of here, because at that point, they're not looking out for the best interest of the organization. They're clicking on things that they shouldn't, and we just need to fire them and get them out of the organization because they're not doing us any favors. In my opinion, that's absolutely the wrong approach to take, because end users already have the perspective that the organization that they work for is not loyal to them. And in many cases, that perception is absolutely accurate. I don't dispute that at all. But you can win a user over by showing them some kindness when they're not necessarily expecting to receive that kindness. So my recommendation would be absolutely require mandatory training, because you want to have some sort of consequence when a user clicks on something. Nobody wants to sit through a training course if they don't have to. So once users learn that they're going to have to do that, they're going to be scrutinizing those messages that come in just to make sure it's not a phishing message, because they don't want to have to sit through that training session again. So that's probably going to go a longer way toward preventing phishing attacks than just about anything else that you can do. Now, another point that's made on this slide, as far as a thing that you need to consider, is can someone else override your decision? So let's say that you've decided, okay, if somebody falls for these attacks repeatedly, we're just going to subject them to more and more training. We're not going to take any kind of disciplinary action against them. You have to consider, can somebody else in your organization come in and say, oh, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to fire them the first time they fall for this. Because at that point, the entire training program may end up being out of your hands, and you may lose control of the whole thing. So just something to think about. So what are some common mistakes that are made with regard to attack simulation training? Well, one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen is launching lots of attacks up front and then not doing any more after that, presumably because the users have learned their lesson at that point, or because you get bored with the tool, or you just get busy and forget to do it. In order for attack simulation training to be effective, you need to have attacks that you're simulating on an ongoing basis. This is one of those things that once you start doing it, you should never back off. Another common mistake is launching attacks in a very predictable way. So if, for example, a user knows that you're going to launch an attack on the first of the month, every month, then they're going to be looking for that. Now, how would they know that you're doing that? Well, maybe back in November, they fell for a phishing attack, simulation that you launched, and it happened to be on the first of the month, and then they did the same thing in December, and that happened to be the first of the month. Well, then that might be an indication to them that you're going to do the same thing on January 1st and February 1st. And so there's a pattern, and they can watch out for that pattern. And as long as it's not the first of the month, they don't have to worry about it. So that's one of the common mistakes that's made. Another common mistake is using the same phishing email messages over and over. So you don't want to repeat your attacks if you can keep from it. You want to keep the attacks varied so that users never really know what to expect. If you think back to one of the previous slides that I showed you, there were a huge number of messages that you could conceivably generate and use to test your end users. So you want to make these phishing attacks as varied as you possibly can so that users don't see a particular message and say, okay, I know that one's an attack because I've seen it before. You always want to keep them on their guard. Now, the one last thing that I want to talk about is going back to something that I mentioned earlier. If I can backtrack a few slides. When I talked about setting up a simulated phishing attack, I mentioned the option that's shown on the screen, redirecting to a custom URL. And when I talked about this particular option, I mentioned it from the standpoint of directing a user to a training module that you've set up yourself, as opposed to using the built-in training modules. And that's something that you can absolutely do. However, there is another option. And I'll just say up front that this isn't something that I've seen done in the real world, but I can't think of a reason in the world why you couldn't do this. The idea is to create your own scareware and set that redirection URL to the scareware that you've created. So that way, when a user clicks on something within a message that they shouldn't click on, instead of getting that little pop-up that says, you've been phished, no harm done, you're human, let's learn from this, instead they get something more like what you see right here, where they legitimately think that they've unleashed a ransomware attack. It looks like ransomware, it acts like ransomware. There's no actual harm happening behind the scenes because it's just scareware. But there's absolutely nothing on the screen to lead the user to believe that they didn't actually unleash a ransomware attack against the organization. Something like this is going to scare the user to death. And when they realize it's not real, they'll probably breathe a sigh of relief and then hopefully never make that mistake again because you scared them so bad the first time. So just something to think about. So one more consideration, and this is something that I believe Ian had mentioned in his presentation as well, is that AI is starting to go a long way toward making these phishing attacks more believable. So I mentioned that some of the common characteristics that you would want to look for is misspellings, sentences that are poorly constructed, grammatical errors, implausible situations, things like that. Well, AI is helping cyber criminals to make those phishing messages more believable. Now, I've seen statements from some of the various AI companies saying that they're taking steps to prevent their tools from being used in this way. And I have a feeling that those statements are probably true, but maybe the technology just hasn't quite caught up yet. Because as an experiment, what I did was I went into the Microsoft Attack Simulation tool, and I just picked a message at random, and I copied the text of that message. And then what I did was I took that message, I pasted it into Notepad, and then I added a line of text above it and said, make this text more professional sounding. Then I copied the entire thing into the Windows clipboard, and I pasted it into ChatGPT. And lo and behold, I didn't think this was going to work, but ChatGPT actually took that phishing message and it made it sound more professional and more plausible. So clearly there is an ability out there for cyber criminals to leverage AI as a way of making their phishing attacks much more convincing than they might otherwise be. So with that said, I am about out of time, but I'd like to go ahead and use what little time I have left to try to answer some questions.
Great. Before we get into questions, first of all, Brian, thank you so much for, as always, a very informative session. Audience, as Brian indicated a couple of slides ago, all of his slides will actually be available to you, including the links, examples, everything in the email that we're going to send with the replay. So keep an eye on it for that email from us in your inbox. All right, Brian, first question from Jennifer is, how do we access that Microsoft Attack Simulation tool? Is there a licensing requirement?
Yeah, it's included with Microsoft 365. If you've got the E5 subscription, then you've already got it. If you've got the E3 subscription, you've got what I'll just call a light version. I believe there's like one or two different simulations that you can run. You can run them as many times as you want, but you don't have the huge variety of messages that you get with E3. And I believe that if you've got an E3 subscription, you can get the security add-on, and that will also give you access to the full-blown tool. Great.
Here's one hot off the presses from Danny. What do you do if you have users, including senior management, that is resistant to learning more about security best practices?
Oh, that's a tough one, and I've run into this one so many times. Because you're right, a lot of times the end users think of security as being your job, not theirs, or they think of security as being one of those things that just really gets in the way and keeps them from being quite so effective at doing their job. So what I would recommend doing in a situation like that is first, taking a look at the filtering that you've got in place. Make sure that you've got the absolute best message filtering that you can possibly get, because if your users are really that resistant, then the best thing that you can do is to try to keep these phishing emails out of your organization in the first place. Beyond that, what I would recommend is probably using some sort of attack simulation and scaring them to death, make them think they've done something horrible, and use that as a way of showing them the importance of not falling for these types of attacks.
Great. Just as an aside, Brian, I love your scareware idea, and maybe we can just devote a whole other summit just on that. Here we go. Prakash has a question about Copilot. Specifically, how is Copilot going to make life easy for small companies? I assume regarding creating simulation training.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I actually just got access to Microsoft 365 Copilot literally yesterday, so I haven't had all that much time to play around with it yet. But on one hand, I could see cyber criminals using that to create more convincing phishing messages, but there may be an opportunity for message recipients to use Copilot as a way of evaluating a message. Like I said, I have not had hardly any time to explore Copilot hands-on yet, but there may be an opportunity, say, within Outlook to type something into Copilot like, is there anything suspicious about this message that might signal that it's a phishing message? I mentioned earlier that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, and if you get a message and you're not sure, it's best just to leave it alone and not click anything in it. Sometimes Copilot may be able to help you make those types of decisions.
Great. This one is from Tim regarding a slide you showed earlier. What kind of cadence would you suggest to avoid training burnout?
I'm not really sure that, well, it kind of depends on what type of training burnout we're talking about. If we're talking about just pure end-user training, aside from any type of attack simulations, then, yeah, you do have to be careful about not burning out the users. But I would say at a minimum, maybe once a year, give them some sort of refresher. Ideally, I would say more frequently than that, like every 6 months. But you kind of have to base it on the feedback that you get from your end users.
Right. From Glenn, I think referring back to those Copilot capabilities that you mentioned earlier, Brian. Glenn asks, these tools based on Microsoft 365, can they be moved to a Microsoft server version running on a more inner circle device?
To the best of my knowledge, no. But having said that, there are third-party tools that you can use that you might be able to do something like that with.
Got it. Another question from Asger, again regarding cadence, training cadence. We know that there are seasons where phishing attacks ramp up. Should we also ramp up simulation training around those periods or keep it steady?
I think that's kind of up to you. What I would say is if you're going to try to ramp it up in those seasons, my advice would be try to anticipate when those seasons are and ramp up your training before those seasons actually begin, just so that way you're making your users vigilant before the real-world attacks actually start ramping up. As far as whether that's a good idea or not, your end users are probably oblivious to the fact that there are more attacks during some seasons than others, but it's not a bad idea. It's certainly something to think about.
Great. A couple more questions that we have time for. This one is from Mike. You mentioned that the obituary email contained a real obituary. What would have been the tip-off that this was a phishing email?
Yeah, there were a couple of tip-offs. The thing that really caused me to realize it was just hovering over a link, and showing that it didn't go where it claimed to go. The other big tip-off for me was the date. The date on the obituary and the date on the email were fairly far apart from one another, so that was a big tip-off. Like, normally if somebody sends out an obituary, they send it right away. So waiting that long, that was kind of an indication that something funny was going on.
Right. Let's see here. This one is from Amber. Do you believe that deepfake attacks are going to become more common as time goes on?
Yeah, I really do. There's always the chance that AI companies will do something to kind of prevent that sort of thing. But right now, AI is accelerating at such a frenzied pace that the capabilities are increasing by the day. And no matter what those capabilities are, there are always going to be criminals who are willing to exploit those capabilities for the wrong reasons. So my guess is that deepfake attacks are going to become more common, and they're going to become a whole lot more convincing than they are today.
And I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Greg. How are attack simulation tools evolving to adapt to the existence of next generation attacks?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I've seen a couple of examples of fake phishing messages that look more polished. My guess is that's how we're probably going to initially see these tools evolve. But I think it'll be really interesting to see if these tools start to latch onto things like deepfake attacks and stuff like that. Not necessarily that such a tool would create a deepfake attack, but that maybe they would try to trick a user into thinking that there was a deepfake video of them, or perform some sort of cyber extortion scheme. I've largely seen these tools stay away from that sort of thing. They tend to focus more on the corporate scenarios rather than things that would affect somebody personally. So my hope is that they'll evolve to start including those sorts of things as well.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the time we have today for this session. Thank you so much, Brian, for another great one.
Thank you for having me.
Here. Yeah, of course.